Russia is launching another wave of intense strikes across Ukraine. At least 2 people were killed in the capital, Kyiv, as Russian drones and missiles hit. That's according to Ukrainian authorities. Even a subway station where people were taking shelter was hit in these attacks. Wolf.
All right, let's go to our senior international correspondent, Fred Pleitgen. And Fred, Ukrainian President Zelensky called for talks with Russia this week, and President Trump has threatened Russia if it doesn't agree to a ceasefire. But it doesn't seem as if any of this is having an impact on Vladimir Putin. He keeps launching rockets and missiles and drones at various civilian targets inside Ukraine, despite all the threats from Washington.
Yeah, and the aerial blitz certainly seems to be continuing at full pace. So, Wolf, what we've heard overnight is that more than 400 drones and missiles were launched by the Russians. Most of them drones. It really seems as though the Russians are drastically increasing and expanding their drone campaign against Ukrainian cities. First and foremost, of course, the capital, Kyiv. You guys were just showing some of the pictures that we saw from last night, and that almost belies the situation that actually happened there on the ground. Folks that we've been speaking to saying that the air raid sirens were on for about 8 hours overnight, and they could hear those drones buzzing over the Ukrainian capital, some of them obviously landing in residential buildings as well. There was one of our producers who was on the scene at one of those buildings where a person said that a drone had hit an apartment near him, and he was only able to get out of his own house by breaking down the door after that had happened. So certainly that aerial blitz very much continuing. The Ukrainians also saying that ballistic missiles were used, and even hypersonic aeroballistic missiles called Kinzhal used by the Russians as well. At the same time, you're absolutely right. The Ukrainians calling for another round of talks, saying they should happen as fast as possible. The Kremlin, Wolf, came out earlier today, this in the form of the spokesman Dmitry Peskov, saying that Vladimir Putin wants talks with the Ukrainians, wants an agreement with the Ukrainians, but at the same time says that the positions of the two sides are so far apart that right now they are, as he put it, diametrically opposed. At this point in time, it's absolutely unclear when the two sides are going to get together to speak again. As you've noted, Wolf, very much, President Trump appears to be losing his patience with Vladimir Putin as the war and, of course, that aerial campaign by the Russians drag on. Wolf.
All right, Fred Pleitgen reporting for us. Fred, thank you very, very much.
Breaking overnight, Russia launched a barrage of cruise, ballistic, and hypersonic missiles across Ukraine. At least 2 people were killed, more than a dozen wounded in the past 24 hours. This comes as Ukrainian drones caused havoc at airports in Moscow, grounding flights and causing long delays. The timing of Russia's strikes is complicated, though, as less than 24 hours ago, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov told Russian state media that Russia is ready to move quickly on achieving a peace deal with Ukraine, but he reiterated that the main goal was to achieve Russia's, quote, objectives. Joining me now is CNN senior military analyst, retired Admiral James Stavridis. He is also the former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO and is partner of the Carlyle Group. Appreciate you being here. Let's start with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. He's calling for talks with Russia next week to push forward ceasefire talks. We're also, though, hearing from the Kremlin spokesperson this morning who says Russia has a draft memorandum, Ukraine has a draft memorandum, and right now they are completely diametrically opposed. So still a lot of work to get done. Where do you start to try and make inroads here?
Russia simply continues to play rope-a-dope with the world. And it's a stack of lies that goes back 3 years, Omar, when we heard from Peskov and the entire Russian leadership, to include Putin, that, oh no, we're not going to invade Ukraine. We're simply holding maneuvers on their borders. Shortly thereafter, the invasion occurred. And here we are today, as you correctly point out, in essentially a military stalemate, attacks on both capitals, rising drone warfare. So what happens next? We have to think of this really as a triangle at this point, not a static Russia, Ukraine. The third point, of course, is the United States of America. Here I give credit to the Trump administration for realizing that Putin is no friend to the United States. He is simply playing us along, and therefore what we ought to do at this point, and the president announced a lead time of 50 days on this, is put additional economic pressure on Russia continue providing weapons to Ukraine, confiscate Russian monies in the hands of the West. Those are the pressure points. If we use those, we can push Putin to the table.
And, you know, some glimpses, or the few glimpses of diplomacy, I will say to this point, is we have seen some prisoner exchanges back and forth between Russia and Ukraine to this point. But the last round of ceasefire talks ended pretty quickly. And the reporting from Russian state media is that Russia put forward maximalist territorial demands as part of their preconditions for a ceasefire, while Ukraine has previously refused to consider any territorial concessions in exchange for peace. What is the role of NATO and the United States? I know you touched on the United States a little bit there, but what is the role of NATO and the U.S. in brokering a ceasefire or peace deal?
NATO has an extremely important role. My successor as Supreme Allied Commander wakes up every morning thinking, how do I get more weapons into the hands of the Ukrainians? These weapons are largely being manufactured and purchased from U.S. defense entities. They're flowing through NATO and our European allies. They're going into the hands of the Ukrainians. These, alongside the fighting spirit of the Ukrainians, are the reasons that Putin has not been able to conquer the entire country. Back to the diplomatic side, Omar, my sense of it is that the Ukrainians are willing to come to the table, have a conversation about where a territorial line should be drawn. Russia is the problem. They continue to demand simply the conquering of Ukraine. We cannot permit that to happen.
And before we go, President Trump, as we talked about a little bit here, had offered that 50-day window. But we heard from the Russians that 50 days, it used to be 24 hours, it used to be 100 days. We've been through all of this. And so what options does the president have? Because, look, Russia is no stranger to sanctions and economic pressures.
The big two that still are unemployed, we haven't used them, are number one, secondary sanctions, Omar. That's moving beyond simply sanctioning Russia and Russian entities and sanctioning those who do business with Russia, notably China and India. Would like to avoid that, but I think that's a very big tool. There's a bill in the Senate to do that. And then secondly, we don't talk about it a lot. We have options in the world of cyber, which could help put some more additional pressures on Russia. And I'll give you a third and final one. Russia has $300 billion, perhaps a bit more than that, of their money in Western banks. That could be confiscated and provided to the Ukrainians for reconstruction. There's three big tools we haven't used yet that we ought to think about.
And those assets still frozen at this point, but as you point out, could be permanently confiscated.
Exactly.
Admiral James Stavridis, really appreciate the time. Thank you.
Well, at least 2 people were killed and 16 injured in Russia's latest wave of strikes on Ukraine. According to officials, Moscow launched 450 missiles and drones overnight, with nationwide air raid warnings issued for most of the country. Now, while the majority of these strikes were shot down, 23 did get through, leading to several fires breaking out across Kyiv and other cities. Despite the attack, the Kremlin says it is in favour of a new round of peace talks, but stressed work needs to be done to bridge the gulf between the two positions. Well, CNN's Claire Sebastian joins me now. It doesn't sound as if Russia's actually saying anything new, apart from the fact it's saying it's prepared or it wants peace talks, which is clearly what the US is pushing for. What else have officials said about these attacks very specifically?
Yeah, Becky, look, even in the dramatic escalation of this air war that we've seen, even given that it's perhaps more unusual at this point for Ukraine not to face an overnight barrage of missiles and drones than it is to face one, this was very large. 450 missiles and drones is up there, not a record, but certainly one of the biggest numbers that we've seen recently. It targeted approximately 9 regions across the country, according to President Zelensky, all the way from Kharkiv in the east, which faced another second round of drone attacks in the morning, over to Ivano-Frankivsk, which is in the far west, down south, Kherson and Mykolaiv, and of course in the capital Kyiv, which is coming under pretty sustained attacks at the moment. They faced an 8-hour air alert pretty much all night. I think it's worth pointing out that as well as the impact of course, the injuries and fatalities that we see, the impact of sleep deprivation is now very real in Ukraine. And I think, look, President Zelensky pointing out that they must now scale up, as he put it, their interceptor capabilities. Well, we do, of course, see discussions today, certainly at the Ukraine Defense Contact Group that's been happening virtually, this grouping of allies that coordinate military aid. Germany saying that it's preparing to contribute to 5 much-needed Patriot systems for Ukraine, even given that the economics of using Patriot systems to shoot down drone attacks on this scale is just unsustainable. So Ukraine is having to innovate, and they've come up with interceptor drones, and they're continuing to scale that up as this air war ramps up. Becky.
Good to have you, Claire. Thank you. Russia, its war on Ukraine has led, of course, to NATO nations boosting, or at least pledging to boost, defence spending to 5% of GDP within the next decade. On the CNN website, you can now read analysis by business and economics reporter Anna Kubin on whether the alliance's European members can afford to fork out billions more on security.